All right, hi you guys. Let's pick up with part 3. We left off on this slide, which if you're looking at the review slides is number 20. So let's talk a little bit about the Green Line and the aftermath of the 1948-1949 Israeli War for Independence. I feel like we have a pretty good grasp on the Green Line. I think that the best image to look at for this slide is this center one. You can see that I'm tracing with the pointer what the Green Line looks like. So essentially, it is what these slides say that it is. It is the de facto border between the Israeli controlled territories and then the West Bank. Although, if you remember, it's really significant for you to realize that the Palestinians did not have control over the territories that were designated for them. The Gaza Strip was controlled by Egypt, and Jordan controlled the West Bank. And in the next slide, we're going to talk about the the Palestinian refugee crisis, and think about why the lack of sovereignty for the Palestinian people matters so much. All right, so let's move on to that. Okay, so the aftermath of the Israeli War for Independence ushered in a refugee crisis, and even though this slide focuses on the Palestinian refugee problem, it is significant for us to realize that there were Israelis that were also displaced. And the numbers were similar, at the very least, after the result of the 1948-1949 war. About 800,000 Israelis were displaced from their previous residences, and many of those actually were in surrounding Arab states. They felt no longer safe, and they felt the need to move, oftentimes within the state of Israel itself. You have approximately 7 million people worldwide that claim Palestinian descent. These people are not exclusively people that were born within the state, within the Palestinian territories. Some of these people are descendants of Palestinian refugees, so we're also talking about young people. And approximately, actually, a significant amount more than half live outside of Palestinian designated territory. They live outside of the former British Mandate. Okay, and a lot of them, as you can see from these dots here, live in Jordan more specifically, because that's one of the most logical places to retreat from the West Bank towards. All right, so the Palestinians that remain within the state of Israel, their status is slightly ambiguous. They are seen as Israeli citizens, at least in a political sense. They are able to vote in the Israeli elections, but in terms of their access to certain resources, it often is significantly less. They do not have as much resources for schools, healthcares, and also public works projects. And we're also thinking about the people that live within the West Bank and Gaza and their lack of resources, in particular their lack of access to healthcare specifically, because they would have to travel into the state of Israel to gain such access, and that often is complicated by thorough checkpoints and lack of access to certain roads. It's also just important for us to really think about what it might mean to be Palestinian culturally, but Israeli in terms of one's national identity. This, in some minds, is a contradiction in itself. I don't think no, I did not. On the original slides, I did put the EQs right next to this slide, but think about how the EQs are significant here and how an Israeli-Palestinian, or Palestinian-Israeli, depending on which way you want to say it, is almost seen as having no identity, or at the very least, a contradictory one. Okay, so what did the Middle East look like after 1949? All right. So first off, it's important for us to realize that with the aftermath of the war, there was no peace per se. The Israeli War for Independence resulted in an armistice. We already know that with regard to the Green Line. And also, it's significant for us to realize that not just the Palestinians, but also surrounding Arab nations continuously display a lack of trust toward Israel, and also a growing fear regarding the increased militarization of the state of Israel. And so there's a new president of Egypt at this point, Abdel Nasser, and he is very much a pan-Arabist, which we discussed earlier, but again, it's an Arab nationalist. So this is not exclusive to the state of Egypt. If you were pan-Arab in your identity, you believed that all Arab people deserved their own identity, deserved their own sovereignty. It's important for us to think about the legacy of the mandate system and also just the legacy of colonialism when thinking about why Pan-Arabism rises when it does. Additionally, with regard to the Cold War framework, Egypt was a non-aligned state in the mid-20th century. So immediately after World War II, Nasser, as well as other Egyptian leaders, did not want to adhere to one of the Cold War ideologies. To a certain extent, they wanted to shape their own future, and if they did adhere to the West or the non-Western economic ideology, they would feel like a satellite state and not a sovereign one. All right, Nasser was a major supporter of the Palestinian people. He did believe in the Palestinian right to return to their homeland, and with regard to Egyptian nationalism specifically, Nasser makes this major move to nationalize the Suez Canal. And we talked about that in class, but just as a refresher, to nationalize the canal would mean to bring it under Egyptian control, because prior to the Suez Crisis, the French and the British ultimately controlled the traffic through the canal. And that, just so you know, is because it was built originally by French architects, or at least it was designed by them. Egyptian laborers actually did the heavy lifting. And then the British also, because they ruled Egypt as a protectorate for a long period of time in the age of imperialism, they felt entitled to control the canal as well. And so when Nasser nationalizes it, this immediately leads to a lot of pushback from Western states, including Israel, which isn't a Western state per se, but for the purpose of this slide, we're going to say that at the very least it is aligned with the West. So what was the Suez Crisis? All right, so after Nasser nationalizes the canal, there is a military invasion of the canal area, and in terms of ground troops, also the Sinai Peninsula itself. And so Britain and France decide to invade the Suez Canal region of Egypt, but Israel joins them. And this is significant because this shows us the rise of Israel's military prominence in the Middle East. All right. Now, this intervention is not successful if you're looking at the British, French, and Israeli perspective. And part of this is because the US and the USSR decide not to take a side in this crisis, and instead they ultimately convince Britain, France, and Israel to back down and retreat back to the former armistice lines, the Green Line, as it were, and then the canal returns to an international waterway. So ultimately, this means that Nasser doesn't fully get what he wants, which is to regain full control over the canal. It does sort of return to the status quo in the sense that it is international, but at the same time, it's important for us to realize that the West is still, in some ways, trying to shape the future of the Middle East. Eisenhower, after the Suez Crisis, proclaims his own doctrine, which dictates that the U.S. is meant to be the chief negotiator in Middle Eastern affairs. And you could think of the long-term results of the Eisenhower Doctrine if you think about the Camp David talks in 1978 or the Camp David talks in 2000, amongst other things. The Oslo Peace Accords, for example. All right, so how does the Eisenhower Doctrine set a precedent for the future U.S. involvement in the Middle East? That's important for you to consider. All right, moving on to the Six-Day War, or the 1967 war. All right, so fast forward after the Suez Crisis. The background context, of course, is that because of the lack of resolution with this Israeli-Palestinian conflict for now almost 2 decades. Tension is, of course, very high, and it almost is sort of a powder keg ready to explode in the Middle East, right? The 1967 war, it was at least partially instigated by some false information. The Soviet Union, which in some ways was courting the state of Syria, told Syrians that Israel was mounting a potential attack into the Golan Heights region of Syria. So you can see my pointer up here. Supposedly this was false information, right? But nonetheless, Syrians also begin to mobilize in anticipation of potential war. And Syria also calls Egypt for military aid because Egypt was the strongest Arab military force in the region. And because Israel gets word of this mobilization, they decide to launch a preemptive strike against both Egypt and Syria. And that starts the 1967 war. Jordan later joins on the Arab side. It joins rather reluctantly, but nonetheless, this is a super fast war. Again, it's called 6 days for a reason. It takes 6 days, and ultimately, because Israel virtually decimates the Egyptian Air Force in a relatively quick period of time, the result is that Israel ends up occupying territory that effectively doubles the size of Israeli-controlled territory in the Middle East. They now control the entire Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. They also occupy the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and Golan Heights. All right, and it's important for us to just pause and realize that military occupation is not the same as annexation. Israel does not actually absorb all these areas into its state, but it wants to. And that is also important for us to realize. All right, so what else? Another major result of this is that the PLO starts to escalate in terms of its activity. The PLO was founded in 1964, so it was already around, but you're going to see the rise of influence of leaders like Yasser Arafat and also the rise of the Fatah group within the PLO, which we'll talk about in a little bit. All right, so what are the sort of different perspectives that resulted from the 1967 war? Well, a lot of this I think is intuitive, but let's just really briefly walk ourselves through it anyway. So when Israel wins new territory after the 1967 war, they see it as the ability to build more of a buffer zone to ensure their own security. And of course, the wall isn't built until the early 2000s, but still you can see how this might be part of their vision eventually, because they do feel like this additional territory is a way that they can increasingly defend their state. This does usher in the increase of settlements in Palestinian designated territories such as the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and now Golan Heights. Also, Jerusalem is now largely controlled, if not completely controlled, by the Israeli government because they now occupy it in a military sense. This includes East Jerusalem, which you know is the hopeful capital of a future state of Palestine, so this is going to infuriate the Palestinians, as you can see in this left-hand column. Right, so the Palestinians call the two areas that were specifically designated to them, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, they call them occupied territories. Some Palestinians start to become increasingly willing to compromise to a certain extent. They realize that they may never get back the territory that was designated for them by the British Mandate itself or also the UN partition. So they say that they're willing to accept the Green Line armistice often because they feel like the Green Line, at the very least, is going to guarantee them more territory than the result of 1967. And lastly, we talked about this previously, but the PLO, it was founded 3 years before this in 1964, but you see that the PLO really escalates, and the PLO is, of course, complex, using both violent and nonviolent forms of protest, but nonetheless, because they feel like they have lost even more as a result of the 1967 Six-Day War, they're becoming increasingly active. This video I highly recommend. If you click on this on slide 27, you can watch the entire thing. And this is going to give you a really thorough understanding of how the settlements increase in prominence, especially after 1967, and how this increasingly complicates the conversation about a two-state solution. All right, cool. Let's just do this slide, and then we'll pick up with the status of Jerusalem. So another really important term for you guys to know is UN Resolution 242. That is on our list of terms for the test. And what this leads to, this is one of the two UN resolutions that you need to know that regard settlements, right? The other one is 2334. So 242, this resolution basically says that Israel needs to withdraw from territories, but since it was translated in British and French, there's a vague interpretation. The English interpretation just says territories. The word "the" is not there. And so the Israeli perspective is that they should withdraw from certain territories that they occupy, but they do not leave Gaza and the West Bank because they feel that that is part of their homeland itself. So this vague interpretation leads the Palestinians to be in a very questionable state. They argue that they are still stateless because they don't actually have the ability to govern themselves, and also because the Israeli military continues to occupy the territory that they live in. You also see an increased lack of freedom of movement in these spaces. Again, the wall is not up yet, but it is very difficult often for Palestinian peoples to have certain careers, to access certain spaces, and most importantly, to access the holy sites in Jerusalem. Also, it became illegal for Palestinians to express nationalism, including in certain circumstances, even representing themselves through their flag. And we could get into that in more detail, but I think when we talk about the Intifada, you'll get a better sense of what this all means. And lastly, Israel defended the settlements because they argue that this shows that they are increasing their national presence in the area. In general, what this means is that this is an increased way for them to solidify their statehood. And lastly, if there are more settlements, if there are more Jewish people living outside of the state of Israel itself and they're living within the West Bank or Gaza, this allows them to also achieve a majority population in these areas, which hence will allow them to have more representation in their government. All right, let's pick up with another video on the status of Jerusalem, so stay tuned for that, and thanks.